1754 to 1800. So remember what we do with this. We're trying to remind ourselves of all the big ideas, right, of this time period to kind of give us a reminder of the things we learned about, right? Also, use it as a way to remind yourself, okay, I totally remember this, or okay, I need some brushing up on that before the final exam and the AP exam. And then we'll try to look back on past questions, past documents the AP exam has used to kind of see what sort of trends we notice about kind of the go-to things that will help us develop a study guide here for what we're going to study. All right, so let's start. 1754. What's that year reference? Kip, what is it?
Starting, or like I guess the beginning of the 7 Years' War.
Yeah, the 7 Years' War. It's also known as what? Yeah, the French and Indian War, right? So you had this massive colonial battle between the British colonists, the French, many of the French's Native American allies. The one big native tribe that kind of sits it out is the Iroquois, even though they lose a lot in this war as well. All right, and then what's 1800 a reference to? D2, what do you think?
The election of Thomas Jefferson.
Absolutely, or the Revolution of 1800. Thomas Jefferson's election, which remember, at that point, we weren't really certain the Constitution was going to work, right? So we thought this thing might fall apart at any given point, right? So this was where it seems like, okay, the Constitution's going to hold. So in other words, we know the French and Indian War, right, is an important conflict, and we know that the election of Jefferson is the end of an important conflict, all the political battles. And in between is obviously what? Yeah, the revolution, right? So we're looking at, okay, so how was the French and Indian War the start of the causes of the revolution? And how is, right, all of the chaos that led to Jefferson's election, kind of indicative of some of the outcomes of the American Revolution, right? So that's really what we're looking at. And so in this time period, this is their kind of main go-to question, cause and effect of the American Revolution. Right? So let's start then with the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, which annoyingly lasted 9 years. Right? And so again, historians really good at naming things. Right? And so from 1754 to 1763. So what we should remember is that, that's not good. Our projector is overheating apparently. Yeah, that's a good thing to pop up at the start of a review session, right? It's like, yeah, what can go wrong here, right? Yeah, that's okay. We'll move to somebody else's room if we have to, right? Right, remember what caused this thing. So we're looking at different parts of the colonies. So remember, at this point in time, the British controlled all of the red on this map. So mostly of the Atlantic seaboard were the British colonies. The green is controlled by the Spanish, mostly modern-day Florida. And then the French controlled much of the interior, right? And so by 1750s, remember these American colonies, these British colonies, are growing rapidly, looking further west, right? And the French have developed a series of forts throughout the Ohio River Valley there to protect their fur trades and things like this. So the French and Indian War is basically where these two colonial powers kind of encroach on each other. And caught in between is then all these Native American tribes who are looking to maintain autonomy, right, advance themselves, trying to figure out which side they're going to bet on in this battle to help them win, right? So most of the natives sided with the French. And why? What did we learn? What should we remember about the French? Why would they side with the French in this affair? Aiden, what do you think?
The French were more assimilated into their society, so they were very with them, and they set up a lot more trading posts instead of imposing on their land.
Absolutely, right? So yeah, the French were much more kind of tolerant, and they integrated into native societies, right? As that was a way that they learned about much of the fur trapping and the trading. And the French also came in smaller numbers, right? Whereas the English, remember, separated from the natives for the most part, and came in much larger numbers in this process. So most natives saw the French as their best opportunity to kind of maintain autonomy in this kind of conflict in North America. The Iroquois tribes, however, were split, right? This confederacy was a little bit split about which side to go on. Certain members of the confederacy sided with the British, others with the French, and this really kind of is where we see the Iroquois Confederacy lose a lot of power as a result of this conflict as well. All right, Now the British win the war, right? And the big kind of outcome of this war is that France is then removed from the colony. And annoyingly, again, for American history students, right, the treaty that ended this war is known as the Treaty of what?
1960 or 1763.
But from where?
Paris.
Yeah, the Treaty of Paris, right?
Okay.
Right? So remember, there's lots of Treaty of Parises throughout American history. This is the first one that we're looking at. The Treaty of Paris of 1763 ends it, and all of a sudden France is gone. And so as a result, what starts to emerge are conflicts between the British colonists now and Great Britain, the mother country there. And why this happens is mostly due to that land of the French and Indian War, right? So right after the French and Indian War was an event known as Pontiac's Rebellion, a massive kind of Native American uprising led by Pontiac, where again, he was able to organize tribes across, right, kind of tribal allegiances. Remember, this is really, really rare in American history for this to occur. But when it does, it usually freaks white colonists out, because if natives ever kind of combine their strength, they would be a very formidable power against much of this expansion. So as a result, what does the King of England decide to do as a result of this? Kip, what's he do?
A proclamation line, to provide, or like white settlers from not going into their lands.
Absolutely, right? So King George writes the Proclamation of 1763. Basically just drawing an arbitrary line across the Alleghenies there that says English colonists can no longer go into this land, right? And why would he do that? Why doesn't he want them to go in? What's the reasoning why he prevents them from going? Nate, what do you think?
Well, basically every conflict is kind of like using resources and people to fight, and that was something that he didn't want to especially because they weren't focusing very much on American colonies.
Yeah.
Like a nuisance.
Exactly, right? Yeah, it'd be kind of annoying, right? It's like, oh, some colonists are going to go over there, they're going to get in a scrap, and then we're going to be expected to bring the British Navy over and annoyingly have to help these colonists, right? So not only is it a nuisance, but what else is it after the French and Indian War that's problematic for them? Tejas, what do you think?
It's an economic detriment. They spend
Absolutely.
so much money.
Yeah, they spent a lot of money on the French and Indian War, right? And so they're in some major debt, and they don't want to pay any more for colonial defense. So they just say, yeah, we're not going to go. Now, why would this hack colonists off? Nihar, why?
They would make them mad because they felt like fighting for the interior was one of the biggest causes of going to war.
Yeah.
And they now just can't have it.
Exactly, right? Remember, the French were dominant in this Ohio River Valley, and colonies wanted to expand west, so this is what they wanted, and now they're being told, oh, you can't have it. So what did a lot of American colonists do despite this proclamation line? Tejas, what did they do?
They just kind of went.
Yeah, they went anyways, right? Because it's not like there were soldiers all along this line preventing, right? It was not like a fortified boundary by any stretch. So they just went anyways, right? And so we start to see kind of the early differences of goals in the post-French and Indian War between England and the American colonists as well. All right, so let's go on from there then. So really in these years that follow, so whereas the French and Indian War then is kind of a long-term cause, the American Revolution, we're going to start to see those immediate causes build from about 1763 all the way up until 1776. And so it's at this point Britain has to change kind of their policy. So in our last review session, we talked about the concept of salutary neglect, right? And what's that mean? What's that term mean? Ethan, what's that mean?
Basically, just kind of they just neglected the colonies. They never they never played an active role in governing the colonies.
Yeah, they kind of left them alone for the most part, right? And kind of let them, so that led to, remember, the colonists developing a lot of their own economic trade routes and things like that. And so now, at this point, right, Parliament's saying, yeah, we got to actually take a little bit more of an active role, right? And why would Parliament be saying that again? Aiden, why?
Because they don't want them to get into more expensive conflicts like the French and Indian War.
Mhm.
Additionally, they also want to drag in some of that revenue because
Yeah.
they're blaming the Americans for the deaths of recruits.
Absolutely, right? So at this point is where Parliament says, you know, that policy of neglect has really kind of lost a lot of revenue, right? And remember that the whole policy of colonization was really mercantilism, Remember mercantilism, where the colonies were supposed to feed the mother country with resources and things like that. So if it's not happening now they're seeing the loss of it. So it's at this point, right, where Parliament begins to pass a number of measures that start to kind of enforce, right, economic measures on the colonists. And the first one and the most influential was the Stamp Act, right? And what should we remember about the Stamp Act? Right, Kip, what should you remember?
I think it was just everything that was published or printed had to have a stamp, then whoever received that like, print would have to pay for that tax on it.
Exactly, right? So yeah, it was anything published, anything printed had to carry a stamp, so you had to pay. It was a pretty small tax, right? So remember, this was not about, oh my gosh, this taxation is immense in terms of how much money it is, right? Why did it anger the colonists, that Stamp Act? Aditya, why? Yeah, right? This is the idea of taxation without representation, right? And so remember that so many of these colonists were very successful people, but in England, the only people taxed without their consents were servants, women, children. So they feel like they have now been kind of put down to this level, right? And so as a result, remember that the colonists have a lot of very successful resistance to these controls, right? So in the Stamp Act, we see the Stamp Act Congress organized. We see the Sons of Liberty organized, and they start kind of mauling people, mostly stamp collectors and things like that. And so the Stamp Act is repealed. But remember, in the repealing of the Stamp Act, what else did Parliament still say, even though they repealed the Stamp Act shortly after 1765? Ethan, what did they say?
They kind of were just like, yeah, we're still going to try to control you. We're just going to have to go about it.
Yeah, they passed the Declaratory Act, which says, yeah, the Stamp Act was a bad idea, but we still have the right to do it, right? And so then they passed the Townshend Acts, which are a number of import taxes on things like glass and paint, right? Manufactured goods coming from Great Britain. So why do they think this is a better tax than the stamp tax? Yeah, what do you think?
Because Americans right now at this point don't have a strong industrial stronghold. They can't make stuff themselves.
Yeah. Exactly, right? So they know there's a market for these goods in America, right? American colonists need the manufactured goods because there's no manufacturing really to speak of at this point in the American colonies, right? And then on top of that, who's the only one paying the tax? Ethan, what do you think?
Like the merchant ships.
Well, yeah, the people buying the goods, right? So you basically get a decision. If you don't want to pay the tax, don't buy the stuff, right? And so they think they can't be mad at this, but what really then continues on is these same kind of protests. Till eventually it gets to the Tea Act. And what should we remember about the Tea Act of 1773, right? What do you think, Ethan?
It actually made tea cheaper in the colonies, right?
Absolutely, right? So yeah, it made tea cheaper, right? Because they had an excess of tea in the British East India Company. So they're like, well, let's just dump all this tea on the colonies, right? We will put a tax on it because we have the right to do that, right? Even though with that tax, tea is still cheaper because so much tax is coming in, right? And so despite the fact that the tea is cheaper, what again do the colonists do? Yeah, they rebel. And the most famous rebellion of this is, Aiden, what is it?
The Boston Tea Party. They just yeeted into the ocean.
Absolutely, right? So the most famous is in Boston, where the Sons of Liberty toss it into the Boston Harbor. It's a harbor, not an ocean, but that's okay. Right? We're not in a geography class. That's all right. Right? Yeah. And so they toss it in, and that then leads to kind of the penultimate event that leads to the revolution is the Intolerable Acts. Well, why? Why is Parliament now looking at the colonists and going, all right, you guys are just super crazy at this point, right? Nate, why?
Well, essentially, like, these, like, acts that they're passing are not, like, really that bad when you take, like, a bigger picture of it. It's
Yeah.
Like, they're kind of, like, almost, like, savage to get so angry.
Yeah. Yeah, the colonists are being like petulant, right? Like just petulant children that know regardless of what you do, they're just going to kind of riot just for riot's sake, right? That you can't even deal with them at this point. And so the Intolerable Acts took now a lot of hardline measures. So all of the members of Parliament, right, the Whigs, who actually were sympathetic towards many of the American colonists, they lost all their power after the Boston Tea Party. And the hardliners in Parliament took over because the Intolerable Acts did what kind of hardline actions now against the colonies, right? And what they do?
They closed the harbor, they have sedition acts, it's like...
Absolutely, yeah. They close Boston Harbor to all kind of trade. They suspend the ability of the Massachusetts legislature, right, to exist. They make you quarter troops, so they bring in more military troops, and local citizens have to quarter them in their home, right, and all these sorts of things. And then any trials of British officials have to happen in London. They're not going to let them happen in the colonies. So in other words, they've taken the right of self-rule away from Massachusetts. And this freaks now all of the colonies out, right? And this is kind of that ultimate event, right? So this resistance is kind of key, right? So when we look at the resistance, it kind of goes in line, right? So it starts with that Stamp Act Congress. Remember, the Stamp Act Congress was the elites in the American colonies, the political elite who came up with the idea of no taxation without representation, right? And so they're mad on a constitutional level. But at the end of the day, did they want to separate at that point? No, they just wanted more kind of what they believed were British rights in a British system. But remember that their most effective form of resistance were through non-importation agreements. And what were those? Jay, what were they?
Pretty much boycotting British goods.
Absolutely, right? And so to do that, the elites had to bring who into this game? Jay, who they had to bring in?
Masses and the common people.
Absolutely, right? And were the colonies an egalitarian society?
No.
Not at all, right? It was a very rigid social structure. So this is the opening. And so as a result, these lower classes begin to kind of go nuts with it, right? So that's where the Sons of Liberty are formed. That's where you get the tarring and the feathering and the attacking of the stamp men. The Committees of Correspondence are formed, which are these kind of local committees in every community that basically just passed on anti-British propaganda. And that's where, remember, the Boston Massacre came from, when Paul Revere said it was a massacre just to keep anti-British sentiment alive, right? And then ultimately, that's what led to the Boston Tea Party. So the elite kind of gave the political argument. The masses, though, pushed the elite towards having to ultimately revolt with the First Continental Congress. Because, remember, Parliament keeps reacting to these demonstrations done by the groups like the Sons of Liberty, ignoring kind of the overtures of the elite who just want more rights. And that ultimately leads, after the Intolerable Acts, to the creation of the First Continental Congress, the first kind of unified political voice of the 13 colonies, right? And so this is kind of important in that process. So remember that up until 1776, most colonists did not want independence. They just wanted more rights, what they deemed were their rights as British citizens. And so it was this kind of slow process to start to convince more and more people that independence was the proper path and not just a list of grievances that we had. And so 1776 is then a key year for the kind of idea of independence, right? And two documents really... Well, one document really started to urge people, and that's Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, right? And so, what should we remember about this document? Why is it so important? Ethan, what should we remember?
It sets the basis for eventually what would become the Constitution, and it kind of influences Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, not the Constitution, but what document?
The Declaration.
The Declaration, right? Remember, two different documents, right? Absolutely, right? So so much of the argument of Thomas Paine is going to influence Jefferson's work in the Declaration. Because Paine was, remember, an English citizen. He's only been in the colonies for a couple of years, right? And so he kind of gives some credibility to the colonies that they're just not making this stuff up. And so, in essence, what Paine argues here, right, is that it's not just the British system, it's the whole of monarchy that's rotten. Right? And so Paine is the first to really argue kind of the point of republicanism, right? That monarchy will never work, right? And so therefore, the Americans should not be looking just at grievances, but should just be looking to break. Right? Remember, he used very plain-spoken language, very common-sense arguments like, hey, we're bigger than they are, and nothing in nature that's smaller controls the bigger, right? And so this kind of helped convince and was widely read in the American colonies. And remember, it was released right at the time of the Second Continental Congress, where they were deciding what to do. Remember, there were a lot of elite, influential men in the Second Continental Congress that did not want to break away. So they were debating what to do. And so Paine's common sense was perfectly timed to kind of raise public sentiment for independence. And so by July of 1776, right, the Declaration of Independence is released. And so remember some of the key kind of events or the key ideas of this declaration. So remember, Jefferson, where Paine says it's all monarchy, Jefferson was very particular to say, no, it's King George III, which is actually kind of weird because Parliament was the one really doing all the stuff that they didn't like, right? And so, first off, why was he very particular to only mention King George and not all monarchies? What do we think?
He realized that we probably won war, really win, or on, and he kind of wanted to kind of appetite to turn, okay, we don't like him.
Absolutely, right? And the French was where we were going to get that help from, right? And the irony of it is that the French were the most absolutist monarchy in Europe at that point in time. So most of what he was saying about King George was actually more true of kind of the French monarch, but we needed their help. So no, it's King George. He's a jerk, right? Just pile on him, right? And then on top of that, right, they don't bag on Parliament because it's kind of ironic because so much of what Jefferson is arguing in the Declaration of Independence is the consent of the governed, right? Natural rights that people have to be represented by their government. So why on a world stage, if you bagged on Parliament, would it not make sense if you're making a lot of rights about the consent of the governed? Tejas, what do you think? Yeah, Parliament is the most democratic government in the world at that point in time. The British Parliament was, right? It had the House of Commons that actually did provide a form of representation, nothing like modern day kind of democracy. But at that point in time, it was probably the most representative government on the planet, right? And so it actually would have opened up to a lot of arguments. So he kind of streamlines it to just King George, right, for that reason, right? But we see the heavy influence of the Enlightenment on Thomas Jefferson's thinking, right? Especially with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which he lifted right from John Locke. It's life, liberty, and property. All right, so these are the two documents then that most importantly kind of then cause the war immediately. Because as soon as this is issued, the war is on, right? All right, so then the next step to understand is, well, how in the world did the colonists win this war? Because they should have lost. So what should we remember about maybe why they won? Aiden, what do you think?
They won Luxembourg.
Wait, say that again?
Yeah,
Luxembourg? Like the country in Europe? Did I miss something?
Or it started with an L. There was like Saratoga.
Luxembourg to Saratoga. That's good.
So it starts with an L, Saratoga.
The L silent.
Aiden, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. I know you took a long test this morning, right? Yeah, Saratoga starts with an L if you didn't know. It's a silent L at the beginning of it, right? Yeah, right? All right, let's pretend we didn't hear anything Aiden just said, right? All right, so why did the colonists win? Jay, what do you think?
The British made a lot of mistakes early on.
Absolutely, right? So the British kind of made a ton of errors. You could make the argument that the British lost this war more than the Americans won it, right? And so we see a lot of those errors mostly happening up around the Northeast, where Howe and Burgoyne were supposed to meet up in New England, but Howe took off for Philadelphia, leaving Burgoyne hung out to dry, and he loses at Saratoga, which is which does not start with an L, unusually, right? So absolutely.
I was confusing it with Civil War stuff.
That's fine. Yeah, okay. I still don't know what the Great Civil War Battle of Luxembourg doesn't exist either, but that's fine. Yeah.
Maybe I was thinking of Lexington.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I think Lexington and Concord is.
Yeah, that's a thing.
Yeah, it is a thing.
Oh, wait, that's a thing in this one.
It's already happened by this point, but yeah, it's a thing, right? You're right. All right. So what else? British mistakes. What else? Wesley, what else?
I think like George was really good at like not dying, even though he didn't win.
Yeah, right? So the tactics of Washington, right? He was, in this time period, it was kind of rare, right? Where he used the tactic of basically realizing as long as you don't lose, right, a defensive war, you can actually win, right? And so instead of kind of using kind of the ego of lining up on a battlefield straight on, which would have most likely seen the American forces crushed by the British, he avoided that, right, and was able to run. Now, it lost him a lot of popularity during the war. His generals were mad. His Congress was talking about removing him. But it was actually a really important strategy. It's called the Fabian strategy of just not losing, right? All right, so what's another reason we give? Madeline, what else?
Didn't the French help them?
Absolutely, right? So the French, when they finally get in, and their alliance is incredibly important to providing financial aid, because prior to that, the Americans were broke, right? Gave them a navy, which they didn't have, which is really important for the kind of the ultimate victory, right? What else?
The famous war crime of attacking on Christmas Eve.
That's what George Washington did do, yeah, right? He did attack, which I don't know if it's a war crime, but
I mean,
you know.
Internationally, isn't attacking on the holiday a war crime?
Only if there is like a truce that's already been agreed upon. But at this point in time, there really were no war crimes at this point in time, right? All right, so the only thing we might add is just this idea of the familiarity of a defensive war, right, as well. But yeah, if we look at it, so what you guys said was exactly right, if we just ignore what Aiden said, right? So
the majority was right.
yeah, so the majority of you are right, right? So yeah, we should understand these things. But probably the most important is that final piece, right? And it also helps set up a lot of the themes after the Revolutionary War, because France played such an important role in the support of the Americans in this victory, that leads to some issues during Washington's presidency after the Revolution, where they would like us to return the favor, and we say, no thank you, right? All right, so if we look at this then, let's kind of continue back on then, right? So the impacts of this war is a big thing that the College Board likes to go to. So where we start is the impact of the Declaration of Independence on this revolution, right? So remember that it laid the groundwork for foreign revolutions. So one of the things, if we're looking at kind of the impact on a global scale, and sometimes the College Board likes to throw this in here to see if you're paying attention, right? And so the themes of the Declaration of Independence show up in later revolutions. They show up in the French Revolution, and realize Jefferson was in France for much of those early days of the French Revolution, so he kind of helped ghostwrite some of the early documents of the French Revolution. They show up in the Haitian Revolution, right, which was one of the first slave revolts to create a nation in world history. And then many of the Latin American revolutions of the early 1800s. Also, you see elements of the Declaration of Independence. So this is a document that's obviously vital to the American Revolution, but makes waves throughout the world, right? And future revolts that use many of the same themes. Now, it also has big impacts here at home, right? So remember, it's going to lead to the first kind of calls for women's rights, right? And so remember, we referred to Abigail Adams in a famous letter she wrote with her husband, John Adams, as they were kind of organizing this new government, where she asked him to remember the ladies in this government, and he gave her the old blow-off, like, oh, of course you're important, but we can't do that, right? Yeah, sort of thing, right? So we start to see, but much of this was based on kind of the call of kind of the basic rights of representation. And this leads to an expanded role in some way for women. This idea of Republican motherhood, right? Because the Declaration creates a republican kind of form of government, of representation. And citizenship then, because you're now a citizen of a nation, not a subject of a monarchy after the Declaration of Independence. So therefore, the idea is that future citizens must be educated in how to be a citizen. And without really any formal schooling at this point in history, it's the mother's role to do that. Right? Because there's no great expansion outside the home of women's rights, there is an expansion in the home, right, to help kind of teach the next generation. And this starts to lead to more educational opportunities for women outside the home. They have to be literate. They have to be well-versed in these things to be able to teach the children in the next generation, right? On top of that, remember that this also, the ideas of the Declaration of Independence, it's not lost on a lot of people that slavery is not compatible with the ideas of the Declaration of Independence, right? When we talk about kind of freedom, right? And this idea that all men are free, that those words kind of start to begin an early emancipation process of slavery. Remember, northern states begin to abolish it slowly by about the 1780s. And by the 1800s, most northern states have kind of taken the call of the Revolution and abolished it, right? Some individual slave owners, even in the South, right, take kind of heed of the revolutionary values and free their slaves, right? However, the states themselves of the South, right, avoid the issue. And so there was a kind of a tipping point for a few years where slavery could have actually died out because we have a lot of evidence that the people were not oblivious to the hypocritical stance of slavery versus the Declaration of Independence. Americans realized it. But by the 1790s, when the cotton gin emerges, right, that gets kind of thrown out the window and slavery booms once again, as it wasn't eradicated after the American Revolution. Right? And so that's an important kind of thing to look at as well here. All right. Now, one of the biggest issues is politically here. And so one of the big calls that this leads to is politically this kind of fear of centralized power. So because the Declaration of Independence put it all in the King of England, right? This leads to this massive fear of central power, which then leads to the first government of the United States, which is the Articles of Confederation. What should we remember about the Articles of Confederation? Yeah, what do you think?
It was extremely loose and gave pretty much almost all the power to the states and to agree on anything pretty much everything.
Absolutely, right? So a confederation, just by title, a confederacy means it's just a loose agreement with very little central power. Aiden, what would you add to that?
It was really bad. There was no real sense of unity.
Mhm.
Like, you would say, I belong to this state instead of I'm a citizen of the U.S.
Yeah, right? So the concept is even during the Revolution and immediately after, there was no sense of United States, right? It was almost like, yeah, this was kind of a temporary thing we did to get rid of the British. Well, now we're going to go back to living our own ways, right? Because we want local authority with local representation. We don't want government to be strong, powerful, centralized in a ways away. So remember that they took certain things away. And we should see some of these things, like the power of taxation, the power to raise a military, which the central government didn't have, were direct relation to the grievances they had with the British during the Revolution, right? So much of their grievances were based on taxation policies. So much were their grievances were the king's use of bringing military into places like Boston and things like that, that they just took those powers away from the central government, right? And so as a result, what this really created were a number of economic issues, trade issues between the states. Why? Why would this lead to those issues? Kip, what do you think?
Because they didn't have a common currency, so they just, it's, a lot harder, I guess.
Absolutely. Right. There's no common currency whatsoever. Some use Spanish dollars, some still use British pounds, some just printed off their own currency. Hey, just what else?
They tax each other.
Absolutely, right? Connecticut would tax New York, right? So if you wanted to buy eggs from New York and you lived in Connecticut, you had to pay a tariff, right? Things like that, right? What else, Aiden?
Also, the federal government, since they couldn't demand taxes, they had to ask states for taxes.
Yeah.
They were not compelled at all to pay.
Absolutely.
So all the states collected taxes that were individual and like not regulated.
Exactly, right? So yeah, every state tax level was different, right? And then this led to kind of an economic depression throughout because the central government during the war borrowed heavily from nations like France and Holland, right? Spain. Well, now they don't have the power to tax, so what are they unable to do? Yeah, pay it back. So this impacts also then foreign trade as well, as nobody's willing to trade with a country who has bad credit, basically. You're not good for it, is what they think. And then on top of that, one other issue emerges. Western land, right? So remember, many of these states are now kind of going to get in fighting wars. Maryland and Pennsylvania almost went to war over Western lands. And so this is probably the one area where the Articles was most effective. And it's called the Northwest Land Ordinance of 1787, which sets up the Northwest Territory of 1787, right? And so, hey, Maddie, come on in, right? And so when we look at the Northwest Territory, it's like the modern-day Great Lakes region, the modern-day Midwest, right? And what it did was it created a pattern of how states would be admitted to the Union, right? And so this was the one thing the Articles did well, because it kind of decreased the desire of states to, shoot at each other for land, right? And this is what was used throughout the 1800s during westward expansion to apply new states to the Union as well, right? And that's the Northwest Land Ordinance, right? So provided process for states. Once it reached a certain amount of people, 60,000 people, it could apply for statehood. And then one of the things it did that also shows us that there was a push to ban slavery was it banned slavery in the Northwest Territories, right? And why that was because they wanted this land to be open to free white men, right? And they thought if slave owners move in, you're kind of bringing a certain class in that will come to dominate. So this is supposed to be open, right? Because the more kind of small patches of land you could sell, this was how they raised revenue. Since the government couldn't tax, they could sell land, right, to raise revenue. So this was the main path for raising revenue for the federal government, or the central government, I should say, not federal yet, right? All right, now, despite this, though, as the population moves west, we start to see that a lot of Westerners start to realize they hate the people living in the east. Right? For the same reasons that the colonists felt like they hated the British. Because they felt like the policies of those that controlled the governments in the East punished the Westerners. Most were the taxation policies. So you get events like the Paxton Boys in Pennsylvania. But the most famous that we'll talk about is Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. Right? Where Daniel Shays, a Western farmer, remember, becomes a leader of this group of rowdy farmers who march on Springfield, Massachusetts, trying to spring people from jails, trying to stop the courts from foreclosing on farmland and things like that, and try to get the state legislature of Massachusetts to get rid of all debt, because people are struggling in the West, right? All right, so that kind of leads to our transition here. So we should note how the government itself was directly related to the Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, which is then surprising when in the mid-1780s, just a few years after the Revolution, there's a big push to create a new government by 1787. So what causes this push of people to want a new constitution? Trinity, what do you think? Yeah, absolutely. Right, this is the problem with democracy, right? Especially like Shays' Rebellion. They're like, if you let everybody have a say, you have to let the crazy people have a say. And we don't really like them much, right? And so this is like, so there's this elite movement, mostly led by guys like Alexander Hamilton, right? Who kind of call for, we should really rethink this process. And at the root of the rethinking of this process is the economic problems of the country. Right? And so we talked a little bit about those economic problems that Shays' Rebellion represents, right? And it also represents the social problems. So why is Shays' Rebellion first rooted in economics? Because what's the root economic problem of the 1780s that the Articles of Confederation can't deal with, right? What do we think? Should remember. Aiden, you're thinking about it.
I'm gonna go with regulation on trade.
Okay, yeah, they can't regulate trade at all, right? Absolutely. So there's no unified trade system whatsoever. And that drives Alexander Hamilton nuts, right? Remember, he is kind of rooted in his economic system that we'll talk about here in a little bit, right? Sismita, what else?
Is it a bunch of farmers and like they're dead?
Yeah, right? So yeah, farmers are in debt, right? And Daniel Shays, remember, was a revolutionary veteran, right? But because the government during the revolution was so broke, what did the government pay soldiers in the revolution with? Yeah, what do you think?
They pay them with bonds saying that we'll pay you back.
Yeah, it was like basically IOUs, right? They would give them a piece of paper, a bond, and say, hey, the government's good for it. The problem was, in the years after the revolution, the government wasn't good for it, right? And so these revolutionary veterans never got paid for their service. They now have no market for their food because they were mostly selling to the government during the war, right? Their farm goods. And then now, because there's no federal ability to tax, who's placing all the taxes but the states, right? And so now you're being asked to pay your taxes even though you never got paid from a government. And if you didn't pay your taxes in this time period, what happened to you? Ethan, what happened to you? Yeah, exactly, right? You get put in these debtors' prisons. So this is kind of a debtors' revolt rooted to the economic problems created by the Articles of Confederation following the American Revolution. And so this leads to, look at the Philadelphia Convention. Let's now go back to what Trinity said at the start. So the elites in American society looked at Shays' Rebellion and said, all right, we got to do something. And how does the Philadelphia Convention prove that? What do we know about the Philadelphia Convention of 1787? Ethan, what should we remember?
Many of the, like Benjamin from Alexander Hamilton, Federalists.
Absolutely, right? Yeah, these guys are some of the elite men, right? They've held political positions. They're some of the wealthiest men in society, the most learned men in society, the most well-educated men in society. So therefore, these guys come in, right? They're not representative of your common people, right? Your common folk. In fact, they are looking to create a government that kind of prevents future Shays rebellions from happening, right? And so we see that. But once they get there, what sort of differences do we note about these men when they get to Philadelphia? Even though they all come from kind of an elite class, what differences start to emerge? Nate, what's one?
Will they have different ideas about how much central government there should be?
Absolutely, right? So like, yeah, the formation of this government, what it should look like. What other differences emerge amongst these men? Ethan, what do you think?
One thing is France.
Yeah, well, that's going to be later on, right? But you're right. Carrie, what do you think?
The idea of who can be voted and the slaves, what do they count?
Absolutely, right? What do you do with slavery in this new system of government? Trinity, what do you think?
The Bill of Rights type thing?
Yeah, right? So how much power does this government have? Which is the Bill of Rights is really kind of dealing with. Right? Wesley, what else?
So how many votes each state gets?
Exactly, representation, right? Ethan, what are you going to add?
Even like economic, like banking.
Yeah, right? Yeah, and trade, like what's going to be taxed? What's able to be taxed? What's not able to be taxed? Aiden, what do you think?
Combining two of those issues, like how much or if any representation you get for slaves.
Absolutely, right? So when we look at all of this together, this leads to a series of compromises. So let's start with the first compromise, which is known as the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise, which compromised the Virginia plans and the New Jersey plans for this new government. Right? So what does this compromise really deal with? Mia, what do you think?
It deals with representation because states with large populations like Virginia wanted to see representation based off of population, and then smaller states like New Jersey wanted to see just equal representation between states, so they compromise and say we'll have two houses, the House of Representatives will be the population.
Good.
And the Senate.
Absolutely, right? So yeah, this is all about representation, right? So remember the Virginia plan heavily favored the large states, right? Because all representation would be based on population. So large states like Virginia, Pennsylvania would dominate this government. The New Jersey plan says, no, let's give everyone equal representation. So the compromise, remember, is the modern system we have. They create two houses of Congress, The Senate, the upper house, where it's equal representation. The House of Representatives, where it's population-based, is what it is. Aiden, we can add.
Wasn't there also a big debate that this solved with how much representation slavery was getting? It was like every persons were like 3.
Yeah, that's the next step, right? So if you're going to bring representation based on population into the equation, well, yeah, what do you do about slaves? Especially where a state like Virginia has almost 300,000 slaves added to their population at this point. Do you count them? Right? And so what they come up with then is the 3/5 compromise. Right? Remember, where they're going to count slaves as 3/5 of a person, right, for both representation, but also for taxation purposes as well. So this leads to really the dominance of Virginia. So remember that Virginia dominates the early government, right, all the way up until Jackson, right, finally takes hold, where every president prior to Jackson was either from Virginia or was part of John Adams' family tree, right, coming out of Massachusetts, right? Yeah. So the large states, good, Aiden, good, nice work, right? All right, from there, on top of there's another big compromise that has to be made during ratification, right? So these 55 men at Philadelphia write a new document, but what has to happen before it actually becomes the government, right? Ethan, what has to happen? Yeah, right, so 9 of the 13 states have to ratify it, have to agree. So this leads to debates in every state across the country, right? And the two sides that debate are the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, right? So what's the difference between these two groups? Tejas, what you remember?
The Federalists are like more on like the side of like adding like central banking and like consolidating power with different actors to their government.
Absolutely, right? So these are the guys calling for kind of the centralization of power. They're pro-Constitution. So they're going around to all these debates advocating the virtues of the Constitution, right? And the most famous Federalists are Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, who collectively write the Federalist Papers, a series of essays. What's that?
Well, wasn't Washington mostly?
Well, yeah, Washington was at the Philadelphia Convention, so he was absolutely a Federalist, but he wasn't out on the front lines. Washington didn't get out on the front lines much in debate, right? That was kind of Hamilton and Madison's job to do that for him, right? And then who made up the Anti-Federalists? So what kind of people were in the Anti-Federalists? Who were they? Nir, what do you think?
People who saw this as not going to work out, they still wanted to give more power back towards the states.
Yeah, these are mostly people that come from smaller states, rural areas, right, who see that this is too much power to a central government, right? What else, Aiden?
Yeah, and like Tommy Jeff helped lead them.
Well, he wasn't there yet, right? Jefferson's in Paris. No, Jefferson's in France at this point in time. And I think he would be offended if you called him Tommy Jeff as well.
This was all through the 5th period, you gotta remember. All right.
Yes.
But anyway, what I was gonna say is they wanted a Bill of Rights to help support it so that the central government didn't get too much.
Okay, good. Yeah, so remember that throughout these debates, the Federalists were winning every argument, right? Anti-Federalists would say the president's like a king, and the Federalists are like, no, it's not. Here's why. Boom, 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 right? And so the Federalists were winning every single argument, but the one they couldn't win, like Aiden said, was the one about a Bill of Rights. Right? Because remember, the big argument the Federalists made is it's silly to add a Bill of Rights. If you list 10 things the government can't do, that now opens up all the things that are not on that list that it can do. Right? But remember, the British Constitution was unwritten. And these are the people that lived through the Revolution. So they're like, yeah, the British had an unwritten document, and look how well that did. We lost all our rights. So we want an unwritten document. Or in the immortal words of Patrick Henry, why not a Bill of Rights? Are you worried it will take up too much paper? Which is an actual quote of Patrick Henry, if you remember that film we watched way back when, right? Yeah, so this is the one big compromise they have to make, where the Federalists win every argument except for the Bill of Rights. So ironically, James Madison writes the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, despite his role as a Federalist. All right, so at that point, the new Constitution is written, it's now accepted. It's just happily ever after story, right? No more conflict, right? Lucas, what you got?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So were there any specific just individuals who were anti-Federalists, or was it just like the smaller states as a whole?
No, there were some really important guys. Like Patrick Henry is a vital kind of member of the American Revolution. George Mason, who was actually a mentor to Thomas Jefferson, was one of the leading anti-federalists, right? So there were some pretty big names on the anti-federalist side of the argument as well. All right, so from there then, the first president is obviously George Washington, right? The first constitutional president, not the first president. I think John Laurens was the first president of the Articles of Confederation government, right? So Washington's presidency will take us from 1789 to 1797. Remember, everybody loved Washington. However, despite the love for Washington, all this conflict emerges, right? And so we start to see a ton of conflict emerge. It's starting with foreign affairs, right? So why? Why did foreign affairs lead to conflict within Washington's administration? Tejas. I just wanted to see, yeah, Aiden was so excited to talk, but...
It had to deal with the French Revolution because the Federalists
All right, you said everything right, but I'm going to correct you on one thing, right? The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists no longer exist. Because remember, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were just a temporary group just to debate the Constitution. What emerges out of this is the Federalists and who? Trinity Hill. Absolutely, right? So the Democratic Republicans. And the best way to remember that those are different groups is that, remember, during the Constitution debate, James Madison was a Federalist. But at this point, Madison is now one of the founders with Jefferson of the Democratic Republicans, right? And so, remember, the French Revolution is raging. They start to get into a war with the British. And remember, Thomas Jefferson advocates for Washington to do what? Right? What do you think, Ethan? Yeah. Absolutely, right? Because they helped us. So they believed that alliance with the French was in perpetuity, right? It was just continuous. However, right, Washington also hears from Alexander Hamilton, who wants him to stay out because Hamilton's focusing more on economic measures, wants open trade with foreign countries, and worries that this will threaten it, right? Which leads then to Washington's proclamation of neutrality. And why would Thomas Jefferson be bent out of shape that Washington went with Hamilton instead of Jefferson in this? Nia, what do you think?
Jefferson's job was international affairs, so
Yeah.
it feels like, well, you're not going to listen to me.
Exactly. Remember, Jefferson was Washington's Secretary of State. And so this is one of those events that helps launch the Democratic Republicans, right, who are in opposition to these sorts of things. Now, on top of that, there's also other issues that have to be worked out, that there's disagreement over. A minor one is Pinckney's Treaty, which kind of finally gets the ability for the United States to navigate the Mississippi River because the Spanish still control it. Right? And that was one of the big, Alexander Hamilton's big pet peeves with the Articles of Confederation, that we couldn't get any product out of the Mississippi River because we didn't have a military to help do anything there. Right? Then we also have kind of issues with the natives. Right? Now this is kind of one of the most important long-lasting problems here, because the natives were never mentioned in the Constitution of the United States. Right? The only thing that's mentioned in the Constitution is free men. Right? That's it. So there's no reference to what role Native Americans play in this new government of the United States. And so as a result, that role is basically going to be organized by actions our government takes towards them. Right? And one of the biggest actions during Washington's presidency is the Battle of Fallen Timbers, where natives are basically forced to sign these treaties, ceding more and more land and putting them into kind of defined areas of lands. This is really the first step towards the starting of kind of reservations of Native Americans and the encroachment on their land as Americans move west. Right? And then on top of that is Jay's Treaty. This is oddly one of those ones that the College Board loves. For something that most of us probably don't spend a ton amount of time on, the College Board loves to throw Jay's Treaty on there. And Jay's Treaty was an effort to end the policy of impressment by the British Navy. And what's impressment again? Ethan, what's that?
Is taking basically any deserters of the British Navy and forcing them back in. We'll just take this guy back
Exactly. They say, oh yeah, these are all British people. We're going to take all of them, right? And so it disrupted American kind of sovereignty, American trade. And so John Jay, who is actually the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, goes to England to negotiate this treaty. And at the end of the day, what a lot of people are angry about, it seems like, okay, we've abandoned our ally from the American Revolution and actually signed a very favorable treaty with our enemy, the British. And this really hacks off a lot of people, right? And John Jay was actually quoted as saying that he could travel throughout the United States at night by the light of the effigies of him burning in protest of his treaty, right? So there's a lot of anger towards what he had done here. And so we're starting to see that one of the things that Washington will warn us about is, hey, we shouldn't get so attached to certain countries because it causes to have internal strife here. And this is what he's referencing, the French Revolution and Jay's treaty there. All right, from there, the domestic issues mostly revolve around the economy, right? And the big issue is Hamilton's economic plan, which has three major parts. So who can remember the three major parts of Hamilton's economic plan? Aiden, you think you got this?
The banking system.
Okay, good. Yeah, absolutely. Right? He's going to create a Bank of the United States, which is one of the three parts.
Oh, and industrialization.
Sort of. That's his end goal, right? Wesley, how are you going to help him out? Absolutely, right? It's called the assumption of state debt, right? Remember, at the end of the Revolution, every state had their own debt. So he wants to take all of that and wrap that into a national debt, right? And then he's going to use what then? If you're going to have a debt, you need a way to pay it off. How's he going to pay it off? Ethan, what do you think?
By tariff.
Exactly, right? Taxes, through tariffs and excise taxes. So these are the three major parts of Hamilton's economic plan, right? And with that, right, so he's going to assume state debt, create a national debt, because what he believes is debt is actually a positive thing. Because if you have debt and you're actually paying it, you get credit from that, right? And he's not wrong, right? As you guys get older, you get like credit ratings, right? We're all rated. And actually, you get a higher rating if you actually have debt and pay it than if you have no debt, you actually get a lower rating, right? Because businesses are like, hey, this guy takes on debt and he actually pays it. That's what we want, right? Because banks want you to have debt because you pay interest, right? And so he believes this will actually help trade in the United States if we have a national debt. We're using these taxes to pay it, and then we're going to create a bank to stabilize it, to store all of these taxes that we are collecting, to kind of uniform currency and things like that. All right, so with that in mind, so why is this a controversial plan? Nihar, why?
With things like the Bank of the United States, there's a huge difference in interpretation of the Constitution. Jefferson says that
Good.
to be hardlined, but Hamilton says if it doesn't say that, you can't do it.
Yeah, so Jefferson cries foul about this, right? Because he's mostly about the bank. Because nowhere in the Constitution, this new Constitution, does it give Congress the ability to charter a bank. And Hamilton says, well, it's in the necessary and proper aspect. We have the ability to make taxes, so therefore a bank is necessary and proper to carry that out. And Jefferson says, no. Right? It's not necessary and proper. Right? Jefferson believes if it's absolutely needed. And what's that remind us about how Jefferson reads the Constitution compared to Hamilton? Sushmita, what do you think?
He had a very hard, strict, interpretation of it, whereas Hamilton thought that there's things that could be added or changed.
Perfect. Yeah, right? So Jefferson is a strict constructionist of the Constitution. At least he says he is, right? Until he becomes president. Then he's like, well, let's see what we can do here, right? And so he says, yeah, if it's not in there, the government can't do it. And who gets the power if it's not given to the federal government in the Constitution? Tejas, what do you think? The states, right? By the Bill of Rights, which says that anything not directly given to the central government is reserved for the states. So this leads to that same argument. So here we are arguing again about how much power the central government has. So it's like a redux of the Federalist, Anti-Federalist debate to a certain degree. Now, this will also create issues in the country. The most notable is the 1791 Whiskey Rebellion, which is a direct rebellion against the excise taxes. Now why? Why are Western farmers in Western Pennsylvania hacked off about the excise tax. What do you think, Ethan?
Because they make the whiskey out of excess amounts of stuff
Mhm.
and they make sell it.
Exactly, right? So, and the tax was not on the selling of whiskey, but it was on the distilling of whiskey. And if you are a farmer in the western part of Pennsylvania who grows grain, right, whiskey was a way to prevent excess grain from just molding, right, in your storehouses, because you use that grain to distill it down to whiskey, right? And your water supply was not real great, so if you needed to hydrate yourself, you drank copious amounts of whiskey back in those days, right? And so they felt that this was, again, an example of Eastern governments passing laws that Westerners have to follow but don't really have a say in. So they do what all good red-blooded Americans do. They start attacking people that collect those taxes. They start burning things down. Except for this rebellion has a different ending than like Shays' rebellion and so many others. Why? What happens? Nir, what happens here? Absolutely, right? 15,000 troops Washington rolls in on this thing, which is actually more than he had to defend the city of New York against the British at the start of the American Revolution, right? And so the rebellion. So this is also an example of the power of this new constitutional government compared to the Articles of Confederation that was powerless against Shays' rebellion just a few years earlier down in Massachusetts, or up in Massachusetts, I should say, if I'm going to be geographically accurate. All right, moving on from there. So what all of this creates is our political parties, right? Our first two political parties. So remember that though they have the same name, they're different, right? You have the Federalists, who are organized around Hamiltonian ideas of strong central government, loose interpretation of the Constitution, favoring urban manufacturers, mostly of the North, right? And they favor good relations with Great Britain because of the trade possibilities that are needed to prevent the British from sabotaging American trade. Right? All right, from there, on the flip side of that, we have the Democratic Republicans, which follow Jeffersonian, as well as James Madison as kind of the right-hand man of Thomas Jefferson, where they want to see... Oh, I just knocked it out. Don't worry. I know. I thought that thing was going to overheat. It's really rallied, though. We should give it up for the Epson projector that's been in this room since about 2006. Right? It's really plugging along up there.
It's
right?
a good day to be a jag, Mr. Sassoli.
Not sure how that's...
That's like only for Mr. Abner. You can only say
Yeah, that's Mr. Abner's thing, right? Absolutely. All right, moving on. Democratic Republicans, limited central government, strict construction of the Constitution, right? Remember, Jefferson believed that the core of the United States was yeoman farmers, right? That the agriculture of the United States was what made people free, virtuous, Republican citizens. Because if you worked for somebody else, you are not truly free. The only way to be free is to own your own land, to farm your own land, to work for yourself, is what the Democratic Republicans, right? And so therefore, they also favor a foreign relationship with the French, right? All right, so from there, how do we know all of this happened? Because George Washington told us so on the way out the door, right? So remember, at the end of his presidency, right, his farewell address, which again is something the College Board loves to throw Washington's farewell address at students year after year after year. Why? What did he warn us of? Trinity, what's one thing?
Political parties.
Absolutely. He says, hey, try not to have political parties. Right? What else does he warn us of? Kip, what do you think?
No, like foreign entanglement.
Exactly, right? Don't have foreign alliances. We just get all angry at each other when we do that. What else does he warn us of? There's two more. Let's add it to it, right? So he also says regionalism, right? Don't get so upset at the other region, right? It allows us to basically divide and disunion as possible. And then the last thing he says is, don't have a standing military, right? Because there's calls for a standing military, permanent military in the United States that relied mostly on militia at this point in time, right? So in other words, I mean, we really focus on these top three most because he's basically summarizing his 2 terms as president, because these things happened right under his nose in his own cabinet between Hamilton and Jefferson, right? And so, despite the Constitution being written, there's still this debate, this constant debate going on, and that finally leads us then to, get to my note sheet here, the end of this unit, which focuses mostly on the election of 1796 and what occurs after. So remember, 1796 now is the first election where we have two candidates moving from different parties, right? So John Adams, remember, is our Federalist candidate, Washington's vice president, and Jefferson, the Democratic Republican candidate, right? Now, who wins this election? Adams, right? But there is a problem with it, right? Why? What immediate problem did this election show us about the way the Constitution was written? What do you think, Wesley? Exactly. Jefferson finished second, so he's vice president, right? And so you have a divided government right from the start, right, in the Adams administration. And so all it really does is we just continue on many of the problems of the Washington presidency. So we have problems in foreign affairs. It's mostly dealing, once again, with the French. So remember the XYZ affair, where the French are now disrupting American shipping. Adams sends ambassadors to France, and those ambassadors are met by 3 French agents, nicknamed Messieurs X, Y, and Z. And they say, yeah, we'll let you see our government, but you have to pay us a bribe first. So this angers everybody back home with France, and leads to an undeclared war with the French. And this makes Thomas Jefferson really unpopular. And so he gets bent out of shape. Remember, Jefferson is pro-French, so he starts going to the newspapers and printing all of these nasty articles about John Adams, right? And has all these writers print horrible things about John Adams. So John Adams says, okay, I see what you're doing there. You can no longer do those things with the Alien and Sedition Acts that are passed in 1798. And remember, the Sedition Acts basically made what to be illegal? Either way, think. Absolutely, right? So now, if you speak out against the government, you can be jailed, right? Is what the Sedition Acts say. And it lays the groundwork for those future acts that occur in World War I as well, right? And so, this is obviously kind of a big issue now, because we're not even 10 years out from the Bill of Rights being written. And what Bill of Rights does this obviously go against? Yeah, free speech, freedom of the press, right? Things like that. And so Jefferson and Madison, remember, whip off the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions in response to this. And these are tremendously important to understanding the long-term kind of causation of the Civil War. Because what do these two resolutions say? Aditya, do you remember?
Is it that you can only follow the laws that you want completely, right?
Yeah, right? It's the concept of nullification. That states entered the Constitution willingly, so therefore, if they believe that that contract in the Constitution is being violated, they have the right to nullify any of those parts, and ultimately the right to leave it if they so choose. So here you have, right, 3 of the kind of founding generation of the Revolution squabbling over what it's supposed to be. So it's at this point that there's very real concern that this thing's going to fall apart, right? And that kind of comes up again with the election of 1800. Because the election of 1800 is, again, a redux between Adams and Jefferson. But this time, Aaron Burr kind of weasels his way in. And what should we remember about this election that caused a lot of fear that now, based on all this stuff, the system's going to fall apart. The Constitution's done. Aditya, what do you think?
Well, no one likes Adams anymore, so Jefferson and Burr tied. That made the vote go to the delegates.
Absolutely, right? So yeah, Jefferson and Burr tie, even though they're part of the same party, right? So they're both Democratic Republicans. So why in the world did they tie? What were the Democratic Republicans trying to do, right, that led to this tie? Nate, what do you think?
Weren't they basically trying to make it so Bill got just enough votes to become the vice president, and then they accidentally...
Yeah, they didn't count well, right? Kind of like our administration with the timing of the SAT today, right? They didn't quite count well, right? I shouldn't have recorded that. But anyways, yeah, right? Yeah, right? So with that, right, So yeah, they didn't count well. They end up in tie, and by the Constitution, right? When there's a tie, the House of Representatives decides. The Federalists control the House of Representatives. So they could have, in essence, just kept John Adams. And if they did that, the whole system falls apart, right? Because we already see the signs of this thing falling apart. But instead, Alexander Hamilton steps forward and throws his support behind who? Jefferson, right? And it's this kind of amazing compromise where Hamilton does not like Jefferson, but he hates Aaron Burr. So he says, Jefferson's a good guy. Burr I don't trust. So the House votes for Jefferson. Burr gets angry and later shoots Alexander Hamilton for later reasons as well. So this is the Revolution of 1800. And why? So why did Jefferson refer to his election as a revolution of 1800? Neil, what do you think?
The biggest reason was the transfer of parties, like a peaceful transfer of parties.
That's exactly what it is, right? It's that peaceful transition of power. Because really nowhere in the world at this point had one group been able to wrest power away from another without there being kind of some sort of violent revolt in doing it, right? And so that's why Jefferson referred to it as a peaceful transition of power. That revolution is that. And so this is why it's a good endpoint, because the effects of the revolution seem settled. They've kind of settled on a government, well, for at least 60 years. They've settled on a government for the next 60 years before they're going to fight about it again, right? As we're going to see. All right, so there is our kind of summary of this time period. So a quick recap of the things we absolutely need to know, right? The French and Indian War, right? Kicks the French out, leaves many of the native tribes hung out to dry, leads to tensions between the colonists, right? The American Revolution, then, is caused by the efforts following the French and Indian War to kind of clamp down on the colonists and kind of extract some revenue that they've kind of let go during that time period of salutary neglect, right? And so, and then Americans resist these policies till eventually it comes to a head by 1776. And then from there, we see aspects of very little social change, right, following, right? Not much change for women, not much change for the class divide, especially once the Constitution is developed and kind of strips democratic rights from a lot of non-landowning peoples, right? No change to slavery, really, despite some attitudes that it should change, right? And it led to a very unstable political and economic situation, right? And the Constitution brought some economic stability, but definitely not social or political, is what we should see, as that raged on until Jefferson's election in 1800. All right, so there you have it. So there is Unit 3. So let's go back and let's look at what the College Board has done with this unit in past. Right? So these are all the things we covered, right? So we're going to go kind of back, and I'll put this whole PowerPoint up. So here are documents they've pulled out, which should show us that we should be okay if we know a lot of these big themes, right? So here's one from the 2015 exam, which was a letter from Jefferson to James Monroe, another one of his Virginia allies, talking about Jay's Treaty, right? And the kind of dissatisfaction towards this treaty with the British. So obviously they're going to ask you questions about political parties, right? Political divides over foreign policy, right? Things like that, right? So we've covered that, right? And then maybe causation of that as well. Also in 2015, they put this document in, which is a document in 1787, which should be a dead giveaway. It's about the Constitution, right? And it was published in the Georgian Gazette. And it is, right, the idea that the new Constitution does not match the Declaration of Independence. So this is obviously from the point of view of what group? Yeah, anti-federalists, right? So yeah, they're going to now ask you all a series of questions about the cause of the Constitution, the outcome of this debate, about the ratification of the Constitution, right? So they like to hit the big themes. Your job is to just recognize those documents, what big theme from this time period they're going towards. All right, also in 2015, a short answer question where they gave us two documents. One from John Adams, writing to Thomas Jefferson once they started talking to each other after their presidencies were over, right? And Benjamin Rush. And what this is, right, is the idea that the revolution happened at different times. So Adams is saying the revolution started from 1760 to 1775. So mostly referring to all of the upheaval against British policies, right? The article by Benjamin Rush says, right, that the revolution never really ended, that it continued on after the revolution. So he's talking about all of the debate about the Constitution and things like that. So what they asked in this short answer question is, what's the difference between these two? What's a piece of evidence that supported one? What's a piece of evidence that supported the other? So all you'd have to do is something from that pre-revolutionary time period, a British taxation supports John Adams, something from the post-revolution time that shows debate, like the development of the Constitution, or Shays' Rebellion, or the Whiskey Rebellion, right, shows what Rush is talking about. Okay? So realize they're pretty straightforward on their test questions from this time period. Right? And then also another one in 2015, they were heavy in this unit on 2015, was a long essay where they wanted you to evaluate the extent to which the 7 Years' War marked a turning point in American relations, and analyzing what changed and what stayed the same. So basically continuity and change, right, that occurred as a result of the French and Indian War, which that's an easy question if we know what we're talking about. So that was one of the long essay questions that year, right? All right, 2016, we see kind of similar trends. So this is, right, how much really changed due to the American Revolution, because it shows us property ownership before the Revolution of people in the government, property ownership after, right? And so basically what you actually see is that wealthy people lost a little bit of say, right, after the American Revolution. The middling people kind of gained a little bit of say, right, is what they're showing us there. So it's all about effects of the American Revolution. From there, this also showed up as a multiple choice question in 2016. And this is a document, again, we're referring to the ratification process of the Constitution. All these pillars were states that ratified the Constitution. Rhode Island's broken because they just ignored the whole thing. They didn't show up to the Constitutional Convention. So they said, why are we going to have a ratification process? This is dumb. And then eventually they realized they're Rhode Island, and they're like tiny, so they have no choice but to join. And so they came along, right? Is what they saw. So this is all about, again, the debate about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, the ratification process, and things of the sort, is what this was dealing with. And then this was a short answer question in 2017, where it shows us British land before 1763, gained from the French after 1763, right? And then gained by Spain, that was lost by France. So obviously this is dealing with the effects of the French and Indian War as well. So this was all about the short answer, right? So they said, this question actually said, what's one thing that caused this map? What was one effect of this map? What was another effect? So really it's, right, the cause was the French and Indian War. The effects were then the Americans started to get bent out of shape at the British. And you could bring up a couple of examples of how they got bent out of shape over this, right? The proclamation and things like that. And then in 2017, they also had a short answer question, right? One historical development that represents an accomplishment of the Articles of Confederation, which the only thing to talk about there is the Northwest Ordinance, right? That's it, right? And most kids struggled on that part. But then the easy part was an argument critics used at revising the Articles, and one way in which the Constitution addressed a criticism of the Articles, right? And that's easy. The power to tax, the power to raise a military, power to regulate trade, anything like that we would talk about, right? And then in 2017, the DBQ came from this time period as well. And so the DBQ was this: evaluate the extent of change in ideas about American independence from 1763 to 1783. So in other words, right, how much did people go from not wanting independence to wanting independence? Which the answer is a lot. Right? Because they did it, right? You just have to prove why, right? Yeah, right? And so that was the DBQ question in 2017. 2018, this question still haunts me because this was a short answer question on 2018's exam, last year's exam, and I read 3,500 of these responses last summer. And, you know, some were good. Many were really bad, right? I read 3,500 of them. That's a lot.
I thought you said 35, and I was like,
Yeah, 3,500. Yeah, it's a lot in a week. 7 days.
how many hours?
Pretty much. I grade at home, so I can kind of set my own schedule.
Did you get paid for this?
For a week's worth of work, I get paid like 3/4 of a month's salary that I would normally make. So there's incentive. Plus, I don't have to pay for any of my relicensing, because as teachers, to get relicensed, we have to have so many hours of like learning that we've done.
And the school doesn't pay for this?
No. They provide some opportunities, but they're really boring, and I don't really like doing them. So,
And this isn't more.
yeah. No, this is better, right? Because I get paid to then basically do it, and then it covers all those hours. So it's fine, right? So this was an article where basically Gary Nash was talking about how the revolution started in the commercial cities. Talking about how places like Boston were upset about like the Navigation Acts, things like that. And Pauline Myers saying, no, the revolution started in Europe with the thinkers of the Enlightenment and things like that. So you basically just had to identify their differences and prove evidence for each, right? So things like the Boston Tea Party would have proved his. Things like the Declaration of Independence, which is rooted in Enlightenment thinking, would have proven hers, right? So that's kind of, so notice how they're all about the big things. And then this was a long essay question in 2018. Evaluate the extent to which the commercial exchange systems, such as mercantilism, fostered change in British North American economy in the period of 1660 to 1775. Which most kids didn't write that question because at that point of the test you're like, whatever, next. Right? It's like that's a lot to do. Right? But again, it's just talking about kind of that before the French and Indian War, there was very little that was preventing them, and after there was very large amounts of regulation. Okay? So what you should take away is when you look at the actual questions they've used over the years, there's nothing that we didn't talk about that a lot of you guys remembered pretty well just from our discussion. You know, and I can say that since Aiden's no longer here, right? Yeah, but a lot of you remembered it pretty well, right? So realize that they're most likely on this unit. They're pretty fair in this unit of test units. So really brush up on these big ideas of the causes and the effects of the revolution. Sound good? All right, guys, get out of here. Have a good night.